No irony here, guys. Girls get it done. But yes, we have another episode of The Boys, and we gotta go now. Solid episode. I feel that it was kind of a filler episode, but there was a lot of interesting things going on, and it was very enjoyable on the whole. The best part for me were all the references to the Zack Snyder Justice League film. They've been putting those in throughout the season, but this episode I thought they were particularly amusing, and I always love that meta humor. I think that getting to see them shoot this movie, getting to see them talking to the writers behind the scenes was really entertaining. I liked the jab at Joss Whedon. I thought that scene actually seemed like something that he would write. I liked the scene that was clearly meant to be a parody of the scene in Avengers Endgame that was a really cringy scene when all the women gather together to take the gauntlet. And I just felt that overall these moments were some of the best moments of the episode. I liked where they had the focus group who was trying to help Maeve figure out what kind of a lesbian she's going to be, and watching her be boxed in, even though she's such a individual, is interesting to see. And this is often how things happen in real life: is that people's attempts to be individuals, or the things that make them individual rather, end up being twisted by people to fit into a box that they can relate to, or at least somewhat understand. When it's like, you don't have to understand everyone to just appreciate who they are. I feel like the scene that is going to stand out in a lot of people's mind this episode is Homelander's Homicidal Fantasy. And I'm sure many people probably, like I was, were uncertain if this was real or not. The minute it happened, I started to question whether or not it was real, because there was so much carnage on display. They've never really shown us Homelander completely unleashed in a real life situation. They've gotten close, but I would argue this was the first time we've seen exactly what kind of mass carnage Homelander would be capable of if he was just completely unrestrained. I think it's impressive that this show manages to balance tones in such a way that I think that people that are fans of superhero films can enjoy it, but also that people like me that might be a little bit weary of what superhero films have become lately could still enjoy the ride and enjoy the playful jabs that it pokes at these films. And this sequence very clearly was a scene that someone like me could take and go, well, that was interesting because it is, character driven, and someone else could watch this scene and go, wow, that's just a spectacular display of superpowers. So I think that's one of the strongest aspects of this show, that it can play to both fan bases. Stormfront obviously gave Homelander a hand with his image this episode. It's kind of funny to me that of all the bad things he's done, that he's getting so much flack for this situation, which is far from the worst thing he's done, that he would accidentally kill a bystander in a foreign country while he's going in to stop a supervillain slash super terrorist slash whatever you want to call them. That this would be the thing that would cause his popularity to dip was an interesting aspect, and it was very, very realistic. I feel that people would be torn on how to respond to this. I definitely imagine that a lot of people would justify this behavior, and it is a dicey issue because he is, in a certain sense, invulnerable, so he can definitely be more careful. He doesn't need to be as cavalier as he is, and that innocent person did not need to die. So there is that aspect. But this episode obviously took this opportunity to make some jabs at the current political environment and the way that people view the news, and also to show how fake news kind of works. And all this was rather on the nose, in my opinion. I'm not saying that it was bad, but if you're going to invoke modern issues, as a lot of shows do, I feel like you really need to have something insightful to say about it. Otherwise, you're just kind of name dropping hot topics. And I kind of feel like that's what The Boys is doing here. It's kind of evoking fake news, but in such a way that it doesn't really have any super insights, at least not from my perspective. If you feel like I'm missing something, let me know in the comments. The Deep is trying to ingratiate his way back into the Seven, and obviously we got our first glimpse of the leader of the church, of the collective, in this promo that the Deep is making for the church, and Maeve may potentially help him to work his way back in. It's gonna be interesting to see what happens with Maeve throughout the rest of this season. She is one of the few soups that you could say was not completely painted in a negative light, and it's interesting her plan to kind of take them down from within, and I'm not sure how this is going to play out. Obviously, this is a major departure from the comics, but I appreciate all the departures from the comics in this show because at this point it's really carved out its own identity, and that's a strong, wise decision from my perspective. Black Noir was in a lot of this episode, and I think you have to give the directors and the cinematographer a lot of credit for making him look even somewhat intimidating in this costume. It's just not a good costume from my perspective. It's the same level of intimidation that, would be required for Batman or a character like that, but the costume just doesn't sell it for me. And I feel like they have to work overtime, kind of the same way that Ridley Scott did in the Alien movie to not make Black Noir look ridiculous, in a similar fashion that they had to work to make the xenomorphs look very, very intimidating when you realize at the end of the day it's just a person in a suit. But they started off promisingly the way that they would only show him over the shoulder or in Billy Butcher's rear view mirror. Obviously, I feel like Black Noir is like the Batman of the Seven, and I wish that they would play him up more and make his actions more similar to Batman, because he generally just shows up and lets people attack him and just stands there and takes it and then turns and it's like, now it's my turn, and then gives them a lethal blow usually. Except in this episode, he doesn't kill anyone for whatever reason. Kind of like in a James Bond movie when the bad guy has James Bond dead to rights and they just sit there and talk. Except Black Noir is a man of no words, so even though he had Mother's Milk and Huey and Billy Butcher dead to rights, he just sat there in silence. And in any other situation, if these had just been stooges, they'd have been dead. But because there are protagonists, they have plot armor that protects them. Otherwise, I think we would be wiping them all off the floor. I didn't think it was a very convincing reason for Black Noir not to kill them, that Butcher blackmailed Giancarlo Esposito's character. I felt like there's no way that he would respond to that kind of blackmail. I mean, in the current fake news environment that they've already established in this episode, I highly doubt that Homelander having someone, do an expose that he supposedly raped a woman, I highly doubt that that would be something that would keep Giancarlo Esposito's character from just getting these adversaries out of the way. We did get some interesting scenes between Huey and Billy this episode. I'm kind of getting tired of these side quests that they have where the characters just go off to a random place and hang out for an episode and then they have some conversations. I don't think this is the strongest aspect of the show, not by a long shot, but I appreciate that they are adding some depth to the characters. They're giving a little bit of nuance. We learn why Billy perhaps values Huey, that he had this younger brother that kind of had a similar role in his life, that kind of kept him in check, that kept him from going too far, and that Huey is now kind of performing that role. And Kimiko this episode obviously gave a new meaning to the word facial peel. Not my joke. Someone else told it first. But Frenchie is trying to get her to stop going out and doing contract killings for his ex. And I felt that the way that Frenchie pleaded with her was very moving. The actor's performance was very strong as he asks her to open up to him and tries to plead for her humanity. And we'll see where this plot line goes. Obviously, she's in a dark place after the death of her brother, and we'll see how long it takes her to find the light again. Lamplighter, a new character played by Shawn Ashmore, is obviously connected to Stormfront in some way, and we know that he killed Mallory's kids, but I'm starting to think that perhaps he's not a bad guy and that he only did it at Stormfront's command, and that he wouldn't have done it for his own part, that he was forced into it somehow. We'll see. It's interesting to see them introducing this character after a little bit of build-up, and I'm curious to see how he will affect the plot going forward. Lastly, I think that is probably the most violent foreplay I've ever seen. I'm not sure I can think of anything that was more violent. And it's noteworthy that Stormfront is able to sustain Homelander's heat vision. I was curious, like, what would or wouldn't kill her. It's been a little bit unclear how powerful she is. She's obviously very powerful, potentially powerful enough to rival Homelander, but it was unclear how well she would stand up to that ability of his. In this episode, the answer was finally shown that yes, it hurts her, but it's not going to stop her. So clearly, I think her strongest asset, though, is her ability to win friends and influence people. She's clearly read that book, and she has won over Homelander by playing to his ego. It was easy for him to move on from his previous love, apparently, because all he needs is someone who stokes his ego. And she even almost won over Starlight, and this episode, clearly the gloves are off between them, but it's interesting that her strength, even though she's a very, very powerful character, seems to come from her ability to get people to like her, to cover up what she really is, and to shape narratives in the public so that the people see her a certain way. And she's obviously nothing like how the public sees her. So that's a really impressive ability that she has that has nothing to do with superpowers. And I think if the writers were at their best, they would find a way for someone to defeat her, not through violence necessarily, but somehow to beat her at her own game of manipulating narratives and to somehow use that against her. That would be, to me, more interesting than her getting defeated in a physical confrontation. So those are my thoughts on this episode, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of this show and other upcoming shows, please consider subscribing. And as always, you can watch more videos right now.